Hello, welcome to the Entrepreneurs Network. I'm Rick Anthony. Any business owner knows that you don't have a business until you have the first sale, and then the second, the third, and so on. But it's the first sale that really puts you in the category of I am a business person. For as long as I can remember, the conventional wisdom has been that if you offered value and convenience and a fair price, the market would come to you. You had a winner. That was then, not so much today. Value, convenience, and fair price aren't enough in today's market, today's volatile market, a changing market. My guest today is Chris Malone, the co-author of a book, The Human Brand, How to Relate to People, Products, and Companies. He and his co-author, Dr. Susan Fisk, a renowned social psychologist at Princeton University, conducted a research project involving, I think it was 45 companies, and learned a great deal about what motivates behavior, what's behind the reasons that we take to a particular company or brand, and found that they are essentially the same reasons that account for our taking to people, individuals, why we connect, the kinds of people with whom we connect. It's all in the book, The Human Brand, How We Relate to People, Products, and Companies. Chris Malone, welcome to the Entrepreneurs Network. Delighted to have you here.
Thanks very much, Rick. It's great to be here.
As we always do, where did you come from? How did you get into this business? And what motivated you and your co-author to do the research and write still another book on branding?
Yes. So I was fortunate to get my training in sales management at Procter & Gamble. Later got my training in brand management at Coca-Cola.
Those are all...
Before going on to become the chief marketing officer of a couple of different Fortune 500 firms.
That's quite an MBA.
That's right, thank you. And I think I got my PhD from the School of Hard Knocks along the way. But in any case, during the course of my career, I got trained in lots of the classical brand management and sales and marketing practices. But I always had kind of a great deal of intellectual curiosity, always very interested in why things work the way they work. And I stumbled across some of Dr. Susan Fisk's work in 2009, and it really struck me as something that made perfect sense given all my experience, and really squared with my own beliefs about how customers connect with brands. I've been fortunate to work at the National Basketball Association and the National Hockey League in professional sports where we marketed athletes and entertainers as brands, and also in those consumer product companies. And so this was a great way to kind of adapt and apply her insights to understanding how brands work in the consumer space.
Was her research specifically on brands?
No, it was about this universal process that humans use all over the world to interact with, form relationships, and become loyal to one another. And I had not seen this model before. It really only became accepted as the universal way that humans interact with one another in the last 5 years.
And she's a social psychologist.
Exactly.
But much of, having read the book, much of what's in the book and your research had more to do with anthropology, it seemed to me. But there's no reference to anthropology, at least that I saw in the book.
Not so much. And so she developed this model called the warmth and competence model over the course of her career. And she's published 8 books, 250 published articles. She's kind of a rock star in the social psychology world. It was not really accepted as a universal way that humans interact with one another. And their belief is, and all the evidence suggests, that humans develop this ability to interact and judge one another with very little information very quickly and very accurately for survival purposes. That in the original game of Survivor, tens of thousands of years ago, the most important decisions that humans made every day were the decisions in their interactions with other people. Because if you got kicked out of the tribe, you didn't get to go to Redemption Island like they do on TV. You were more likely dead within a week or so because we're so dependent on one another for food, clothing, shelter, and protection. And so that's how they believe that we develop this skill that is really operating in our subconscious, but is having a huge impact on all our behavior.
And the principles or findings, and what you and she have written, are transcend different cultures, different nations. So it's true around the world?
Absolutely.
In developed as well as developing countries?
Exactly, exactly. They've researched it in actually nearly 40 countries now. It's been validated over the past decade, and it's been shown to explain over 80% of all human behavior in social context. And so when I saw that, I said, wow, I wonder if this is what's driving our behavior and interacting with companies and brands as well. Here was an opportunity to test that. And so I kind of contacted her out of the blue, looked her up online, sent her an email and said, I've become a fan of your work. Would you be interested in hearing about an idea I have for you? She was nice enough to return my email. We had a conversation, and now 3 years and 45 companies and brands later, we've got a book about what we learned.
How did you conduct the research?
So we started out basically adapting this model of warmth and competence. Warmth meaning, what are the intentions of other people towards me? Are they a friend or a foe? They can help me or hurt me. Or for lack of a better term, what degree of warmth of intention can I pick up from them? And then what is that I believe is their ability to carry out those intentions or their competence. And so we took her model that basically boils down to warm, friendly, competent, and capable, and asked 1,000 U.S. adults across the country. Initially, our first study was 8 different brands that were all well-known household names, and asked them how they perceive those brands on those basic warmth and competence perceptions. And what we found is that it was highly predictive. Over 50% of all the purchase intent and brand loyalty that customers had towards those brands could be deducted from just those 4 basic attributes before we started talking about price, quality, reliability, any of that stuff, before we got into any of the features and benefits, and that was quite striking.
And what were the criteria? Warmth, friendly?
Warm, friendly, competent, and capable.
Competent and capable.
Right.
As I read the book, I was reminded that, I guess it was maybe 15 years ago, at least in my consulting career, I think it was 15 years ago, we started talking about social consciousness, and that those companies, brands, that had developed and had integrated the philosophy as part of the ethos of social consciousness, being accountable to, responsible for the community.
Right.
And so that their products, services, and so on were not in conflict with. Isn't that part of warmth?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what we think is going on with the rapid rise and growth of many cause-based, purpose-based companies, whether it's in organics or in green energy or what have you. And that if you think about it, for most of human history, commerce between humans was conducted face-to-face.
Yes.
And that the decisions we made were as much about the person and the relationship I had with them as it was the product or service.
Handshake was your hand was your bond.
Exactly, exactly. And so we are really wired to interact in that way.
Yes.
And our psychology hasn't changed for tens of thousands of years. And what we're realizing now, having tested and validated this, is that much more of our decision is based on what we know about the people behind those products and companies.
Yes.
Even if we never have direct contact with them. You know, it's what we infer from the packaging or the product experience or what we hear or what we learn. And so when we see a company that is doing things that are in the interest of others, we draw all kinds of conclusions very quickly from that. We assume that they would be good to us and that they can be trusted and they do all kinds of other good things as well. That's just how we've become wired to make judgments very quickly.
Are we wired to be trusting?
Actually,
to want to trust? To want to trust other people?
It's actually our preferred state. And actually Dr. Susan Fisk's work suggests that it takes a lot less mental energy. We are much more comfortable operating in a trusting environment. We really prefer to trust someone, and that to be cynical and distrustful and cautious actually requires a lot more mental energy and effort than it does to kind of be concluded that we can trust someone and kind of let our guard down.
But I'm trying to think of the number of times I've been wrong. I trusted my gut intuition, and I was wrong. Because the person turned out either not to be as authentic as I had thought, or I was simply wrong and didn't pick up the signals, the markers that this was not a trustworthy person or a trustworthy company or brand.
Right. I think what's happened during the course of what I would call the Middle Ages of marketing, the last 150 years, even Industrial Revolution, I think companies and brands have become more sophisticated about managing that perception and trying to build an image of trustworthiness. That is kind of crumbling now with social networks and mobile devices and e-commerce, where now we have much more information about the people that we're dealing with than ever before, and they can't control that dialogue. And so now I think we're kind of emerging from that, and it's much harder for a company or brand to kind of put up a false facade, an image that they want to control, and that we are finding out exactly who we're dealing with, and we'll make a judgment on whether we believe in that or not.
The term branding or brand is such an elusive term. How do you define brand?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The work that we have done has led us to believe that actually people were the first brands. Faces were the first logos, and all the branded trade and commerce that has evolved over the last several thousand years is simply an adaptation of the way that we interact with people. And so as a result, I think my definition of what is a brand is actually different than it would have been 5 years ago from all the classical brand management training I would gotten. And I would say that actually a brand is the name and reputation that we associate with a person, a group of people, or the products and services provided by those people or persons. And that is a broader definition than it used to be traditionally. Traditionally, if you'd asked me, it would be, hey, it's that place in our brain that we store our experiences about a product or a service. And it was more abstract, and it was more mysterious, and it was more, kind of ephemeral, if you will.
Yes.
Whereas now I think we can better understand what a brand is if we put it back into people to people, back into human terms. And that everything we know about people and building a relationship with them and damaging a relationship with them also applies to brands and companies.
I guess the definition I have in mind is compatible with that. My definition that I've learned from others is that a brand is nothing more than a set of expectations. The sender, if you will,
That's right.
Sends out whatever information, and it creates a set of expectations. To the extent that they meet or exceed, I'm happy.
Exactly.
To the extent that they fall short of my expectations, the relationship is gone.
Absolutely. I think
Perhaps irreparably.
That's very consistent. And I think that's what we found is that this model of warmth and competence perceptions actually leads to a predictable pattern of emotions, and it's the emotions that we have that drive that behavior. And frequently, if our perceptions are inconsistent with our expectations, that's where you get the disconnect. Or if those expectations or perceptions are exceeded, then we become much more trusting and connected to a company or brand.
As you know, because you've been a student of it, and you've worked with some of the biggest and best brands available, there's been an awful lot written, seminars, workshops, videotapes, etc., on marketing and branding and so on. What is different? What have you uncovered, you and Dr. Fisk uncovered, that make your treatise different from everything else that's available?
Yeah, so I think it's basically this warmth and competence model. And the fact that it wasn't developed until the last 10 years and really widely accepted, in my view, it's a very powerful model of understanding human behavior that almost no one has heard about outside of academia. And so if you go back into the 50s and 60s, when most of the current thinking and schools of thought around brands and customer loyalty and things of that nature were developed, it was developed in the absence of the access to this model. And so now we've actually gone back and tested and challenged a lot of what we thought we knew about brands and loyalty. And we were fortunate to have actually 7 peer-reviewed academic papers published last year in the Journal of Consumer Psychology. And it's really turning on its ear a lot of conventional thought in academia about what we thought about how brands form.
Chris, you're a pioneer.
I'm standing on the shoulders of Susan Fisk. I can't take too much more credit. I saw the connection. It was more of a, here's an opportunity to build on something that has been done in academia and apply it to the field of branding and customer loyalty.
Much of what we have here on this program has to do with early stage entrepreneurs, first time aspiring entrepreneurs. How is your book and the lessons, principles in your book, how does that apply to an early stage company, to someone who's still dreaming about creating a brand?
Sure.
What are the lessons?
Well, I think it's actually even more applicable to entrepreneurs and small companies than it is to large companies, because it's much easier to act on. And so there are a couple of reasons for that. First is that in a small company, you still, in most cases, have direct contact with your customers or your clients, right? In large companies, so much of the contact that we would otherwise have with them has been digitized, automated, outsourced, or minimized. And it's those human interactions where we pick up all those warmth and competence perceptions. And so they become more and more of a faceless monolith. Whereas an entrepreneur can kind of start from scratch and kind of focus more on building those relationships. The other side of it is that it is really hard for larger companies, particularly public companies, to really shift their priorities to focus on building a lasting relationship with customers. There is so much pressure on them to deliver results in the short term that more often than not, they are maximizing shareholder value at the expense of their customers and their employees. And that's sending a strong message that we cannot trust them, that they are not acting in our best interest. They are looking to profit at our expense. And it's real difficult to get out of that mode. You know, some companies like PepsiCo have really tried to become much more socially conscious and focused on the environment and health and wellness and so forth. And they've just been battered by investors and analysts that say, just sell your sugar water and snack food and make a profit and stop worrying about saving the world. And so in that regard, I think it's a lot easier to build a company based on warmth and competence than it is to change one that's been around for a long time, operating on conventional wisdom.
And I totally agree. On the other hand, as you were talking and describing an early stage company and the opportunity to have more touch than a larger company and so on, the paradox seems to be early stage companies, particularly by investors and by the wave of technology, are being forced to adapt the technology, the apps, social media and so on, all of which get in the way of the relationship with the customer.
That's right.
And are supposed to be proxies for touch.
Right.
So you're saying resist that?
I'm saying that we really got to be careful. I mean, if we thought that the economies of scale and all the efficiency and cost savings did not have a cost associated with it, we were sadly mistaken. The cost is the lack of that human interaction and making it more difficult to build loyalty and trust and to convey warmth to our customers.
Yes.
I think ideally what you want to do is you want to balance that technology with still having human contact. One of my favorite examples is Zappos, which of course is everybody's favorite example for everything. But what I think is really great about what they do is, despite that they are by definition in the e-commerce business, that they've got their 800 number on every page on their website, which is very uncommon in e-commerce. And they really encourage you to call for any reason at all. They'll stay on the phone with you for hours with no expectation of you making a purchase. And the people on the other end are not called the customer service department. They're called the customer loyalty department. And they know that if they can get you involved in a conversation and have you meet one of their people, you're going to pick up the genuine warmth and intention that they have towards you and stack a lot of their policies in your favor as well. So I think it's a great example of balancing the scale and efficiency of technology with humanity and contact and warmth as well.
It reminded me of another phrase, which I'm sure you've heard because it's been around forever. They won't care what you know until they know that you care.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so true. And I think in the way that I was taught in business and the way that companies run, I think that in the past 100 years we've kind of created this cult of competence. Conventional wisdom, it's all about our skill and our strategy and our better mousetrap and our analytics and all of that other stuff. And that stuff is important, but it's not sufficient. We've got to have that to even be considered, but it's not where loyalty comes from.
It's so sterile. Really so sterile.
Exactly.
You said earlier that there are no differences around the globe, at least in terms of culture or nationality or so on. Are there generational differences? As I was reading, I would think that the approach, this philosophy that you and Dr. Fisk are espounding, would probably be more applicable to the Gen Y, the millennials, who tend to be more social and use and rely on social media, trust it. Rather than perhaps the more skeptical baby boomers.
Yeah.
Is that a fair observation?
It's interesting that some of the research that we did was analyzed using our data from two professors from Villanova University. Ron Hill, who is a really well-known marketing academic in the field of marketing and public policy, and Dr. Arante Bennett, his colleague. And they analyzed our data looking for demographic differences in how consumers perceive companies and brands. And they found something very interesting. And that is that, generally speaking, older consumers tend to be more cynical and distrustful, have less, perceived warmth for companies. Exactly. Whereas younger ones tend to be more trusting and more perceiving of warmth and so forth. And so they did see a very different perception there. And we believe, just as you're suggesting, that older consumers have more life experience. You've had more disappointments. You've got more experience to judge that. However, we think with social networks and media and so forth, because we know that Gen Xers and even younger generations are very skeptical of large companies.
Yes.
And what we think is happening is, because there is so much more information available about why companies are doing what they're doing, we learn about it much more quickly, that they are becoming skeptical much earlier in their lives than would have for earlier generations who did not have access to that information, did not have that experience as quickly. And so we think that it's really changing, and that's why it's really causing companies to have to do business differently. We think we're entering a relationship renaissance where it's going to be all about the relationship with the customer again, and it's going to look a lot more similar to the way business was done before the Industrial Revolution than it has the last 50 years, just supercharged with technology.
Again, part of me wants to agree with you, but another part of me says, well, wait a minute. The rage today, everybody's talking about predictive analytics. Everybody's talking about you stand in front of a kiosk, and that kiosk, that inanimate thing, is reading you, is picking up who you are, how you move, facial expressions, etc. All that data is going into a big data bank. And there are other people in another room using algorithms to figure out what you're not what you're likely to do, what you will do, what you will buy, when you will buy it, why you will buy it, and so on. Doesn't that get in the way of establishing a relationship with a brand or a product or even other people?
Absolutely.
Because you know you're being manipulated.
Absolutely, and I think there are a lot of people that think that big data is the panacea for
It's
growth of the future. And I am a real skeptic.
Blown way out of proportion.
I'm a real skeptic of that. And I've got a degree in statistics. I'm a very analytical person and so forth. So I can certainly see the value of some of that. But I think more often than not, it depends on how it's used.
Yes.
And so if it's just another way for companies and brands to rummage through our digital trash so they can send us more targeted offers,
Yes.
and not actually get to know us or care about what we're interested in, then it's going to come across like me sending stuff to my neighbor that I found in their trash. It's going to be creepy and voyeuristic.
Yeah.
Whereas if we use that data to better develop a relationship with the customer, so now I remember who your children are, now I know what your interests are, and I have some contact with you and I demonstrate an interest in that, then that shows me that you actually care. You remember me. You know who I am and have my interest in mind. And our reaction to that is going to be very different. But we've got to have some direct contact with those customers that gives us permission to use that information. Or otherwise, it's going to seem very manipulative.
Then the analytics, the technology seems to be overkill, because again, insurance agents have been doing what you just described forever.
Right.
You got birthday cards, Christmas cards, stay in touch, send me a newsletter. All of that has been part of traditional marketing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the differences between like a B2B
Yeah.
or a professional service environment and what we've known as consumer marketing are actually getting closer and closer together.
Interesting.
And we will see more and more of that kind of
Yes.
personal attention being granted by large companies that for 100 years couldn't have any direct contact with their end consumers because it wasn't practical.
It has also been true, may not be true today, that building a brand, however we define it, takes time and lots of money. Is that as true today as it has been in the past? Time and money to build a brand? Because we both know brands that have been built overnight because of social media.
Absolutely. I think it takes more time than money today, and I think for all the reasons you just described. So social media, viral videos, the democratization of news,
Yes.
Essentially, whether it's coming off of Reddit or blogs or what have you, it takes much less time to get on the radar screen and is much less costly than it used to be. I do think still, though, that building a brand still happens one customer at a time. And that you have to kind of initiate, and you've got to take a long-term view of, I'm trying to initiate a relationship with someone and demonstrate that I'm putting their best interests first, not just close a sale as quickly as possible. And I think that even with these startup companies that are venture-backed, I think they ought to ask themselves the question, is growing this fast really in the best interest of our customers?
Yeah.
Or are we going to be damaging the longevity of what we have? It's possible to grow very quickly, but kind of not have a very solid loyalty foundation, and then it just becomes more costly to retain customers and more costly to attract new ones if you haven't built that loyalty along the way.
You and Dr. Fish point out in the book that a crisis or bad news can be a golden opportunity. I think I understood what you meant when I read it, and you confirmed what I thought was the case. And you give some examples.
Yeah, so it turns out, and we found this is one of the most surprising things that we found, but it turns out that customers can be remarkably forgiving, and that in fact when a crisis or a recall or a problem occurs, it provides kind of a rare opportunity for us to see what a company or brand really cares about most. Are you interested in limiting your liability or limiting your cost or kind of minimizing the damage to yourself, or are you going to put my best interests first? And that really provides a window into who they really are and what they really care about as a person. And so we've seen examples, and we studied a whole host of product recalls and scandals and so forth, and found that in those instances where the company kind of came out up front and said, you know what, we made a mistake. It was with the best of intentions. Here's how it happens. We're going to take total responsibility for it. We're going to make sure that it doesn't impact you. That those customers in response were like, you know what? A short-term lapse in competence is very forgivable if your intentions are good. And they were actually more loyal to that company or brand afterwards than if there'd not been a problem at all. Whereas on the other hand, if you make a bad mistake and it was for reasons that did not have your customer's best interest in mind. We're trying to cut corners or increase profits or things of that nature. And then you try to direct attention away, you try to cover it up, you try to say it's not our fault, you try to say, we don't want to take on the liability. That is really unforgivable. And that is where the trust gets broken. And it's very hard to recover from that.
You've just described Obamacare.
high expectations, under-delivered,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah.
And then now what's happening in Washington is
Wasn't
the
me.
finger pointing,
Yeah,
basically trying to minimize the damage.
and the
Whereas-
resistance is saying, mea culpa, we screwed up. Because
Exactly.
politically, they're concerned that it will...
They're worried about
it
the
will-
short term
yeah,
rather than
yeah.
the long term.
Well, it has always been, both parties. What specific advice do you have for an early stage company, other than what you were saying before?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that despite this remarkable gift that we all have to be able to quickly judge the intentions and abilities of other people with
Yes.
limited information, we also are cursed with an equal inability to accurately perceive how we are coming across to others. And companies and brands are destroying, and frankly, often when they don't have ill intentions, are often alienating and driving away their customers because they don't recognize that their policies, practices, and processes are sending the message that we don't trust you. And so the first thing that I would recommend and try to be more cognizant of is become more self-aware about how we are coming across to others from a warmth and competence standpoint. It turns out a lot of what we've been taught in business and their standard practice, whether it's on price increases or return policies or things like that, are sending a very negative message and frankly aren't flying in the new world the way they used to in the other, and that we're going to be forced to change the way we do business. So that would be step number one, is to become more self-aware. And then I think the second piece I would say is focus more on initiating and maintaining long-term relationships with customers, more so than fast growth and quick transactions. You'll get much more loyalty and it will cost you much less to grow, and you'll grow much more profitably and consistently in the future if you're focused on building long-term relationships.
Do you lay out step-by-step formula in the book?
Actually, we do. And in fact, we've developed a free application called the Loyalty Test. It's available at loyaltytest.com. And it allows you to actually gather feedback anonymously from your customers or your friends or what have you on how you are perceived from a warmth and competence standpoint. And it's a good starting point to let you know where you stand and then start to take a look at, based on that feedback, what do I need to do differently in my policies, practices, and processes to deliver and exhibit more warmth.
That's interesting. I'll look that up and suggest that many of the early stage companies we deal with take a look at it. I remember, do you remember the id? In your
The
schooling?
ego and the id,
Yeah,
it's
the
a
id
Freudian.
is, I remember, yeah, we are really three people. It's who we think we are, who others think we are, and who we really are.
Right.
Relate that to what you're talking about. Who we think we are, who others think we are, and who we really are.
It's a good analogy, actually. I hadn't thought of that. I'm sure Dr. Fisk would have a much more cogent response to this. But I think that it's the fact that there are those separate perceptions, what other people think that we are and what we think that we are, is where that disconnect is happening,
Exactly,
essentially. And I think part of it is that, I'm able to see your face, I'm able to pick up a lot of your nonverbal communication, your facial expressions. Apparently, we judge whether we can trust someone within a second or so of actually seeing their face, and we can't see any of that stuff on ourselves when we're acting and behaving. We don't realize how we're coming across, and I think it is that matter of perspective, and that we don't have the ability to pick up and process our own behavior and communication from a warmth and competence standpoint while we're so focused on getting it out of us.
And our education system, particularly higher education system, conditions us not to be authentic, conditions us to somehow compensate for what we think are our weaknesses or other people think are our weaknesses. Rather than presenting ourselves as, these are my strengths and these are my weaknesses, I'd like to be of help, let's collaborate so that we get the best of all of what we are together.
Exactly.
That seems almost too simple, but people are building businesses on that, small businesses, as you said, mom and pop operations for the most part.
Well, I tell you, I've worked in large companies for 25 years. I got a master's degree in business from the Wharton School, and it seems like every year there is some new theory or model of how the world works or doesn't work coming out. And for me, I often ask myself, how can that all be true? I see a lot of value in all of them, but how is there something that could tie them all together or something more simple?
And this does it.
For me, this is what connects the dots. It helps identify what is it that makes all of these other things true. They all have a bit of warmth and competence in them. And it sometimes, doesn't it seem like we make things more complicated than they need to? For me, to have a simple framework that you can use to guide 80% of what we do is very powerful for me.
Consultants are the worst, and I are one.
And
you are.
Right, I am too.
And we complicate things. The book is The Human Brand, How to Relate to People, Products, and Companies. The book is available on Amazon, I assume.
Amazon and Barnes & Noble stores, all everywhere you find books, iTunes, you name it.
And the website is?
thehumanbrand.com. We've got lots of tools like the loyalty test there, videos, stories, examples of success and failure.
That's great.
You should find it helpful.
Is it
tool.
being well received?
Very good receiving so far. All the positive reviews are starting to roll in. We've been fortunate to be featured as one of the top 5 books to read this fall by Entrepreneur Magazine.
That's great. That's
as well as Fortune Magazine and a few others.
Marvelous. Well, good luck with it. Why don't we have you back when this is made into a movie?
Terrific.
Okay.
When that happens, I'll be glad to come back.
Chris, thanks very much. Again, the book is The Human Brand, How to Relate to People, Products, and Companies. Get a copy of it, even if you don't have a business, because if you're a consumer, there are a lot of good lessons in here. It'll help you understand how you're being used, abused, misused, and how to avoid all of that as well, and establish good, productive, and healthy relationships. Until next time, I'm Rick Anthony. This is the Entrepreneurs Network. Take very good care of yourselves.